Section 7 of Thoughts on Art and Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Claire Stewart. Thoughts on Art and Life by Leonardo da Vinci. Translated by Maurice Baring and edited by Louis Einstein. Thoughts on Art Part 2. Painting is mute poetry. What poet will place before thee in words, O lover, the true semblance of thy idea with such truth as will the painter? Who is he who will show thee rivers, woods, valleys, and plains, which will recall to thee the pleasures of the past, with greater truth than the painter? And if thou sayest that painting is mute poetry in itself, unless there be some one to speak for it and tell what it represents, seest thou not then that thy book is on a lower plane? Because even if it have a man to speak for it, nothing of the subject which is related can be seen, as it is seen when a picture is explained. And the pictures, if action represented and the mental attributes of the figures are in the true proportion one to another, will be understood in the same way as if they spoke. Painting is mute poetry, and poetry is blind painting. Therefore, these two forms of poetry, or rather these two forms of painting, have exchanged the senses through which they should reach the intellect. Because if they are both of them painting, they must reach the brain by the noblest sense, namely the eye. If they are both of them poetry, they must reach the brain by the less noble sense, that is, the hearing. Therefore, we will appoint the man born deaf to be the judge of painting, and the man born blind to be the judge of poetry. And if in the painting the movements are appropriate to the mental attributes of the figures which are engaged in any kind of action, there is no doubt that the deaf man will understand the action and the intentions of the figures, but the blind man will never understand what the poet shows, and what constitutes the glory of the poetry, since one of the noblest functions of its art is to describe the deeds and the subjects of stories, and adorned in delectable places with transparent waters in which the green recesses of their course can be seen as the waves disport themselves over meadows and fine pebbles, and the plants which are mingled with them, and the gliding fishes, and similar descriptions, which might just as well be made to a stone as to a man born blind, since he has never seen that which composes the beauty of the world, that is, light, darkness, color, body, shape, place, distance, propinquity, motion, and rest, which are the 10 ornaments of nature. But the deaf man, lacking the less noble sense, although he has at the same time lost the gift of speech, since, never having heard words spoken, he has never been able to learn any language, will nevertheless perfectly understand every attribute of the human body better than a man who can speak and hear, and likewise he will know the works of painters and what is represented in them, and the action which is appropriate to such figures. Painting is mute poetry. Painting is mute poetry, and poetry is blind painting, and both imitate nature to the best of their powers, and both can demonstrate moral principles, as Apelles did in his Calumny. And since painting ministers to the most noble of the senses, the eye, a harmonious proportion ensues from it, that is to say, that just as from the concord of many diverse voices at the same moment, there ensues a well-proportioned harmony, which will please the sense of hearing to such an extent that the listeners in dizzy admiration are like men half ravished of their senses. Still greater will be the effect of the beautiful proportions of a celestial face in a picture from whose proportions a harmonious concord will ensue, which delights the eye in one moment, just as music delights the ear. And if this harmonious beauty is shown to one who is the lover of the woman from whom such great beauty has been copied, he will most certainly be struck dizzy with admiration, and incomparable joy superior to that afforded by all the other senses. But with regard to poetry, which in order to afford the representation of a perfect beauty is obliged to describe each separate part in detail, a representation which in painting produces the harmony described above, no further charm is produced than would occur in music if each voice were to be heard separately at various intervals of time, whence no concord would ensue, just as if we wished to show a countenance bit by bit, always covering up the parts already shown, forgetfulness would prevent the production of any harmonious concord, since the eye could not apprehend the parts with its visual faculty at the same moment. The same thing occurs in the beauty of any object created by the poet, for as its parts are related separately, at separate times, the memory receives no harmony from it. The impression of painting. Painting reveals itself immediately to thee with the semblance given it by its creator, and affords to the chief of the senses as great a delight as any object created by nature. And the poet in this case reveals the same objects to the brain by the channel of the hearing, the inferior sense, and affords the eye no more pleasure than it derives from anything which is related. Now consider what a difference there is between hearing the recital of a thing which in the course of time gives pleasure to the eye, and perceiving it with the same velocity with which we apprehend the works of nature. And in addition to the fact that a long interval of time is necessary to read the works of the poets, it often occurs that they are not understood, and it is necessary to make diverse comments on them, and it is exceedingly rare that the commentators are agreed as to the meaning of the poet. And often the readers peruse but a small portion of their works, owing to lack of time, but the works of the painter are immediately understood by those who behold them. Painting manifests its essence to thee in an instant of time, its essence by the visual faculty, the very means by which the perception apprehends natural objects, and in the same duration of time. And in this space of time the sense-satisfying harmony of the proportion of the parts composing the whole is formed. And poetry apprehends the same things, but by a sense inferior to that of the eyesight, which bears the images of the objects named to the perception with greater confusion and less speed. Not in such wise acts the eye, the true intermediary between the object and the perception, for it immediately communicates the true semblance and image of what is represented before it with the greatest accuracy. Whence that proportion arises called harmony, which with sweet concord delights the sense in the same way as the harmony of diverse voices delights the ear. And this harmony is less worthy than that which delights the eye, because for every part of it that is born a part dies, and it dies as fast as it is born. This cannot occur in the case of the eye, because if thou presentest a beautiful living mortal to the eye, composed of a harmony of fair limbs, its beauty is not so transient nor so quickly destroyed as that of music. On the contrary, it has permanent duration, and allows thee to behold and consider it, and is not reborn as in the case of music, which is played many times over. Nor will it weary thee. On the contrary, thou becomes enamored with it, and the result it produces is that all the senses, together with the eye, would wish to possess it, and it seems that they would wish to compete with the eye. It appears that the mouth desires it for itself, if the mouth can be considered as a sense. The ear takes pleasure in hearing its beauty. The sense of touch would like to penetrate into all its pores. The nose also would like to receive the air it exhales. Time in a few years destroys this harmony, but this does not occur in the case of beauty depicted by the painter, because time preserves it for long, and the eye, as far as its function is concerned, receives as much pleasure from the depicted as from the living beauty. Touch alone is lacking to the painted beauty. Touch, which is the elder brother of sight, which after it has attained its purpose does not prevent the reason from considering the divine beauty. And in this case the picture copied from the living beauty acts for the greater part as a substitute. and the description of the poet cannot accomplish this. The poet, who is now set up as a rival to the painter, but does not perceive that time sets a division between the words in which he describes the various parts of the beauty, and that forgetfulness intervenes and divides the proportions which he cannot name without great prolixity. He cannot compose the harmonious concord which is formed of divine proportions. And on this account, beauty cannot be described in the same space of time in which a painted beauty can be seen, and it is a sin against nature to attempt to transmit by the ear that which should be transmitted by the eye. What prompts thee, O man, to abandon thy habitations in the city, to leave thy parents and friends, and to seek rural spots in the mountains and valleys, if it not be the natural beauty of the world, which, if thou reflectest, thou dost enjoy solely by means of the sense of sight? And if the poet wishes to be called a painter in this connection also, why didst thou not take the descriptions of places made by the poet and remain at home without exposing thyself to the heat of the sun? Oh, would not this have been more profitable and less fatiguing to thee, since this can be done in the cool without motion and danger of illness? But the soul could not enjoy the benefit of the eyes, the windows of its dwelling, and it could not note the character of joyous places. It could not see the shady valleys watered by the sportiveness of the winding rivers. It could not see the various flowers, which with their colors make a harmony for the eye, and all the other objects which the eye can apprehend. But if the painter in the cold and rigorous season of winter can evoke for thee the landscapes, variegated and otherwise, in which thou didst experience thy happiness, if near some fountain thou canst see thyself, a lover with thy beloved, in the flowery fields under the soft shadow of the budding boughs, wilt thou not experience a greater pleasure than in hearing the same effect described by the poet? Here the poet answers, admitting these arguments. But he maintains that he surpasses the painter because he causes men to speak and reason in diverse fictions, in which he invents things that do not exist, and that he will incite men to take arms, and describe the heavens, the stars, nature, and the arts, and everything. To which we reply that none of these things of which he speaks is his true profession. But if he wishes to speak and make orations, it can be shown that he is surpassed by the orator in this province. And if he speaks of astrology, that he has stolen the subject of the astrologer, and in the case of philosophy, of the philosopher, and that in reality poetry has no true position, and merits no more consideration than a shopkeeper who collects goods made by various workmen. As soon as the poet ceases to represent by means of words the phenomena of nature, he then ceases to act as a painter, because if the poet leaves such representation and describes the flowery and persuasive speech of him to whom he wishes to give speech, he then becomes an orator and neither a poet nor a painter, and if he speaks of the heavens he becomes an astrologer and a philosopher and a theologian if he discourses of nature or God. But if he returns to the description of any object he would rival the painter, if with words he could satisfy the eye as the painter does. But the spirit of the science of painting deals with all works, human as well as divine, which are terminated by their surfaces, that is, the lines of the limits of bodies by means of which the sculptor is required to achieve perfection in his art. She, with her fundamental rules, i.e., drawing, teaches the architect how to work so that his building may be pleasant to the eye. She teaches the makers of diverse vases, the goldsmiths, weavers, embroiderers. She has found the characters with which diverse languages find expression. She has given symbols to the mathematicians. She has taught geometry its figures, and instructed the astrologers, the makers of machines and engineers. Poet and painter. The poet says that his science consists of invention and rhythm, and this is the simple body of poetry: invention as regards the subject matter, and rhythm as regards the verse, which he afterwards clothes with all the sciences. To which the painter rejoins that he is governed by the same necessities in the science of painting, that is to say, invention and measure, fancy as regards the subject matter which he must invent, and measure as regards the matters painted, so that they may be in proportion, but that he does not make use of three sciences. On the contrary, it is rather the other sciences that make use of painting, as for instance, astrology, which effects nothing without the aid of perspective, the principal link of painting. That is, mathematical astronomy and not fallacious astrology. Let those who by reason of the existence of fools make a profession of it forgive me. The poet says he describes an object, that he represents another full of beautiful allegory. The painter says he is capable of doing the same, and in this respect he is also a poet. And if the poet says he can incite men to love, which is the most important fact among every kind of animal, the painter can do the same, all the more so because he presents the lover with an image of his beloved, and the lover often does with it what he would not do with the writer's delineation of the same charms, i.e., talk with it and kiss it. So great is the painter's influence on the minds of men that he incites them to love and become enamored of a picture which does not represent any living woman. And if the poet pleases the sense by means of the ear, the painter does so by the eye, which is the superior sense. I will enlarge no further on this theme, save to say that if a good painter were to represent the fury of a battle, and if the poet were to describe one, and both representations were put before the public together, you will see before which of the two most of the spectators will stop, to which of the two they will pay most attention, which of the two will be the most praised, and give the greater satisfaction. Without any doubt, the painting, being infinitely the most beautiful and useful, will please the most. Write the name of God in some spot, and set up his image opposite, and you will see which one will be the most reverenced. While painting embraces in itself all the forms of nature, you have nothing save words, which are not universal like forms. If you have the effects of the representation, we have the representation of the effects. Take a poet who describes the charms of a woman to her lover, and a painter who represents her, and you will see whither nature leads the enamored critic. Certainly the proof should rest on the verdict of experience. You have classed painting among the mechanical arts, but, truly, if painters were as apt at praising their own works in writing as you are, it would not lie under the stigma of so unhonored a name. If you call it mechanical because it is by manual work, and that the hand represents the conception of the imagination, you writers put down with the pen the conceptions of your mind. And if you say that it is mechanical because it is done for money, who is more guilty of this error, if error it can be called, than you? If you lecture in the schools, do you not go to whomever rewards you most? Do you perform any work without some pay? Although I do not say this to blame such opinions, because all labor expects its reward, and if a poet were to say, I will devise with my fancy a work which shall be pregnant with meaning, the painter can do the same, as Apelles did when he painted the calumny. End of section 7.